I want to begin our lesson time today by a little experiment. I want you to think of your local church body. If you're a member here, that will be this group. If not, then you just think of that local body of which you are a part. Now, once you have that in mind, I want you to reduce your thoughts to a single word. What single word comes to your mind when you think about your local body? Now, that's pretty risky because there's any number of things that could come to mind. And some of them will be positive and some would be negative. We, for example, might think of our body as being a loving body or a caring body, healthy body. Might be some that would say we have a sick body, an ill body, a connected body, a vibrant body, or perhaps a faded or disconnected, a growing or shrinking, exciting or boring, traditional or progressive. Any number of phrases that we could come up with. Now, I had us do that experiment because I'm going to tell you one that I bet nobody thought of. But before I leave this point, I just want to make a point. And that is that whatever word we come up with probably reveals as much or more about us than it does about the body. Because it reveals our perception of the body, which may be accurate or inaccurate. It may tell about us and our involvement or lack thereof. It may speak to our problem solving or our being a part of a problem. So that's just a little side sermon all by itself. It's not even in your lesson outline this morning. That one's totally free. Okay, of all the words that anybody thought of, I bet no one thought of this one. Anybody think of that? I bet nobody thought of your spiritual body as being a virgin. And yet, as we have been looking at different symbols in Scripture that identify the church and that are given by Jesus, by apostles, to help us understand the nature of the church, we began last week to look at those terms that were feminine and talked about God and His nature and some of the characteristics of femininity that are revealed about even God. And what I want us to think about this week, amid all of these different symbols that we've examined so far, is that the church is to be a virgin. Now, there's just two main points I want to look at this morning. The first one is this. This symbolism, this imagery, is often attached to the church of the Old Testament, to the called out of the Old Testament, to ancient Israel, to the people of God who were separated under the old law. This term is used very frequently, and we're very familiar with books like Hosea that will demonstrate to us what unfaithfulness is all about and how God continues to long for His people's faithfulness. But so is the term virgin, and I want us to begin with the prophet Jeremiah. Therefore, thus says the Lord, ask now among the nations, who ever heard the like of this? The virgin of Israel has done an appalling thing. Does the snow of Lebanon forsake the rock and the open country, or the cold flowing water from a foreign land ever snatched away? For my people have forgotten me. They have burned incense to worthless gods, and they have stumbled from their ways, from the ancient paths to walk in bypaths, not on the highway. God says, you know what? It doesn't make sense for my people who are supposed to belong to me, my virgin people who are mine, to offer sacrifice to a strange place. It's like the snow being off of the mountains or the water not running cold. It makes no sense. Israel had forsaken the pure attachment that they were supposed to hold with God. And again, we find this often repeated throughout the Old Testament. But even though such purity gets lost, and again, as we familiarize ourselves with the course of ancient history, we recognize that God repeatedly is willing to restore the people, to bring them back to a place of purity and devotion. So we read passages like this. The Lord appeared to him from afar, saying, I have loved you with an everlasting love. Therefore I have drawn you with loving kindness. Again, I will build you, and you will be rebuilt. O Virgin Israel, again you will take up your tambourines and go forth to the dances of the merrymakers. God says, I will restore. I will restore. Now again, I want you to just process what God is saying here, because God is saying, I will restore your virginity. Folks, and from our perspective, that's impossible. But from God's, it's not. God says, I will make you my pure virgins again. The restoration of Israel as God's virgin was a promise tied to his love and power. However, it is also contingent upon Israel's willingness to restore and to be purified and to devote themselves again to God. Jeremiah outlines some of how that willingness should be demonstrated. And we go to Jeremiah chapter 31 and try to pay particular attention to this text, because we'll exegete from this text some of the points that God says this is how it's supposed to happen. Number one, set up for yourselves road marks. Place for yourselves guideposts. Direct your mind to the highways, the way by which you went. Return, O virgin Israel, return to these your cities. How long will you go here and there, O faithless daughter? For the Lord has created a new thing in the earth. A woman will encompass a man. Okay, I want to look at a number of things that those two verses just outlined of how Israel could come back to that place of restoration. And the first one is this. God says, I want you to set up road signs. Road signs. The original word has with it the idea, it's from the root word that means desert or parched. So the image that I think we need to get of these road signs is they are danger signs. They are warning signs. They are to keep us out of the places that are parched and deserted from the presence of God. And God says, you need to set up for yourself road signs. The idea is to mark an area, to avoid dangers, and to make sure that we don't get out there where spiritual nutrients are going to be lost and we will starve. Stay out of those places. So you set up signs. Then he says, secondly, I want you to also put up guideposts. Say, well, what's the difference? Well, I think the signs have to do with danger, and guideposts have to do with recognizing this is where I want to be. The original word meant a high heap. It came to be identified as pillars, which marked various locations. It's rooted in the word for palm tree. Now again, process this part of the world. The reference has just been made to desert. And now God says, I want you to set up signposts, but then I also want you to set up guideposts, and those guideposts are like a palm tree in the desert. What else do we call that? An oasis. What is provided in an oasis? Salvation from the desert. So God tells Jeremiah, in the process of coming back to being my pure virgin, you set up signs that warn you about danger, but then you also recognize there's a place of living water. And you make that your guidepost. You make that the place you want to be. You make that your high place for the place you want to reach for. And then he says, I want you to direct your minds to the highway. These signs and these guideposts become the means of heart or mind direction. As Chris outlined this morning, how the whole idea of materialism is really an issue of our mind and where we direct our mind. And that's the idea that's being revealed here in Jeremiah. That we have to take our minds and direct them to, and I love the expression that's used here, the highway. The root means exalted or mounted up. The idea is a thoroughfare, a viaduct, a staircase. So it really carries the idea of a higher way. I want you to take your minds, you have these guideposts, you have these signs, these warning signs, and I want you to take your mind and you direct your mind to a higher place. You climb a staircase. You take your focus off of this and you make it on me. You set your hearts, your minds to the highway. He also says that this is the way by which you went. This elevated path was not uncharted territory for Israel. They had been there before, but they had made the decision to offer incense to false gods, and in so doing they had failed to become and to maintain being God's pure virgin. And so God says, this is the way from which you went. I want you to know that you have fallen, you have come down, and now then you need to take your mind and you need to direct it back up to where it once was. You need to go back where you were. The word even carries the idea of being carried along. And I love the implication of that, because what God is saying is you were here once. You need to put your mind there again, your heart there again, and guess who will carry me back there? God will carry me back up there. I was once there. I just have to submit to God to let him accomplish that. Then he says return. The root means to turn back, not the idea of returning to the starting point. This is not going back to begin the race again. He is just saying, I need for you to come back where you were at. You need to return. Generally, it carries the idea of retreat, coming back to a former place. God says, you were on the highway, you've left me. I need for you to set your mind on coming back, to retreat, and I'll get you there. I will get you there. And then I love, because the expression is asked here, how long? How long? And I think what God is asking through Jeremiah is, how long do you want to stay distant from God? How long do you want to stay out in that parched desert? How long do you want to miss the spiritual nutrients that you knew God once gave you? How long do you want to do that? I think also, how much distance do you want to put between you and God? How far do you want to go? How much of the world do you want to partake of? And how much of God do you want to be a part of? How much distance? How much space? How much space do you want? You know, ironically, that's kind of a modern term. You know, give me my space, or don't get in my space, or get out of my space. How much space do you want from God? And Jeremiah says, how much distance, how much space, how much time, to what degree do you want to bear the separation between you and God? How long do you want to continue down the path that is impure? That's a very potent question that Jeremiah asks within the context of coming back. And folks, it's something we have to process when we have distanced ourselves from God, when we've lost our purity with God. We need to ask ourselves, how long? How long? And I love the expression that I hear people use every once in a while now, and that's, how's that working for you? How does it work for you to distance yourself from God? Okay. How long do you want to be faithless? Interesting that faithless is the same Hebrew word as the word return. But you're returning to yourself instead of to God. God says, I want you to return to me, or you can choose faithfulness, which is returning to self. They had turned back. They'd retreated to the place of self-serving. They were apostate. They had fallen. And then it says, the Lord has created a new thing. The Lord is the only one who can restore this kind of purity. The new thing means to rebuild, to make new, to renew, or to repair. God is the only one that can take someone who has lost their spiritual purity and restore it to them. He can repair them. He can rebuild them, make them new again. And then it ends by saying, and God's going to do this new thing. A woman is going to embrace a man. And the New Living, I think, gives the sense of it very well. It says, Israel will embrace her God. That's going to be the new thing. And the idea of encompass or embrace is it could be translated surround or bordered, like those ladies in Europe, surrounded. God's going to do a new thing, and what's going to happen is these faithful people are going to surround God. It's going to be new. It's going to be the way it once was. It's going to be renewed. It's going to be a pure thing. And he says, that can happen. Israel is going to embrace her God. Okay, I'd be amiss if I didn't preach a little bit about some of those points. So let's talk about some application very briefly here. First of all, God calls his virgins today to set up signs and guideposts which keep them on the highway. Folks, God expects every one of his children today to discipline themselves for the purpose of godliness. And that is nothing more than setting up signposts and setting up guideposts that are going to keep me on the highway of God. God expects us to do that. He doesn't expect somebody else to do it for us. He doesn't expect the church to do it for us. He doesn't expect the preacher to preach them for us. He expects each of us to establish those guideposts. And He expects that those things are going to be firmly planted and that they're going to be designed for a specific purpose to keep us headed towards God. I've shared with young people before, as I've talked with them, about how important it is for them to, in the jungle of sexual purity, to make for themselves unshakable unbreakables. And they sit down and they say, this is absolutely something I will never do until I say I do. And every young person needs to do that. Need to draw those things firmly. They need to be established. Those guideposts, those guideposts that are set high standards, every young person needs to do that. And you know what? It's not only young people need to do that. It's people who have been married for 50 years need to do that as well. The strength of those unshakable unbreakables is that we make them in advance of the test. That's where their strength lies. You know, the time for a young person to worry about what they will and will not do is not in the back seat of a car. That's not the time. Those guideposts need to be set before. But you know what, adults, there's times when you and I are just as spiritually naive and we refuse to set spiritual guideposts which will direct us to the highway of God, and we wait until we're in the middle of the test to even think about it. And do you know who rejoices with that delay? The one who hopes he can get a foothold into our spiritual desire. We need to establish those unshakable unbreakables. Don't wait until somebody's mistreated you to decide how you're going to react when somebody mistreats you. Set the guidepost. Don't wait until somebody says something about you and it hurts before you decide, what am I going to do when somebody says something about me and it hurts? Set up a danger sign. Set up a guidepost that keeps you pointed in the highway. Don't wait until you're angry before you develop a strategy to deal with anger. Don't give the devil that kind of foothold. Don't wait to decide if you're going to get up to go to Bible class at 8:45 on Sunday morning. Set up a guidepost. When one looks to the example of Jesus, I think, Jesus was tempted in all fashion like we are, yet without sin, is what the Hebrew writer says. One of the things, it wasn't just supernatural power that kept Jesus from sinning. One of the things that I believe very firmly kept Jesus from sinning was in advance, he prepared for the test. He had guideposts that he himself planted, which kept him from being drawn away into the temptation and it turning sinful for him. Think about how much forethought it took for Jesus on a day in which he was hungry and tired and sat down by a well, and his disciples went to get food, and they come back, and Jesus mentions to them that he doesn't need food. And the disciples, well, who fed you? They're looking around. Well, where'd you get food? And Jesus' response is, my food is to do the will of the Father, of him who sent me. He just had that conversation with that Samaritan woman. And I want to suggest to you that Jesus had followed a guidepost. And he wasn't hungry anymore. Because he had obeyed. And the reason he obeyed is because he had this pre-thought. I'm here to do what God sent me to do. Mark chapter 9, same kind of thing. We must work the works of him who sent me. Jesus is predetermined. His guideposts are set. His signs are there. Or when he's facing the devil himself, Jesus came up with, "It is written." It is written. What are those? Jesus has warning signs that he's put up for himself, guideposts that he's placed in his heart and in his mind. And where did they come from? From the book. It is written. It is written. And he uses those to ward off Satan himself. And how about in the garden? No one, I think, can deny that Jesus is asking God if there might be another plan that would work. Was he hopeful for that? Did he desire that? But then it's like Jesus looks up at that danger sign. He looks to that guidepost. He looks to the highway. And he says, "But if there's not, I will drink this cup." Wow. Prepared for in advance. Folks, I think if we're honest with ourselves, we'll have to admit that the greatest problem we have with temptation is when we get there unprepared. When we haven't prepared for the trial. Okay, another little application point. I think it's important also to ask ourselves how far, how much time, how much space, and to what degree am I willing to go? If my spiritual life is not what it once was, how far am I willing to let it degrade? How much of it will I let go of? How much? When will I have enough? Whatever has any of us entangled in impurity will continue to keep us entangled until we decide that we've had enough. You've heard of, "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired." The turmoil that has taken us far enough, used up enough of our time and energy, we reach a point where we've had enough, then we are ready to do something about it. I love how Peter puts this. You won't spend the rest of your lives chasing your own desires, but you will be anxious to do the will of God. You have had enough in the past of the evil things that godless people enjoy. Their immorality, their lust, their feasting and drunkenness, their wild parties, and their terrible worship of idols. You've had enough. Folks, it's a powerful question for every one of us to look at our spiritual life and look at the things that are dragging our spiritual life down and to ask, when will I have enough of what it is that's tearing me down? When will it be enough? Another application is that defiled virgins can return by retreating from sinful practices. Like the father who is waiting for the prodigal in Luke chapter 15, our God is always ready to bring back restoration. There is no one of us who ever steps far enough away from our God that he doesn't long to restore us to purity again. There is no stink that the Father's new robe cannot cover. There are no stains on the hands which his ring of forgiveness cannot cleanse. There are no feet so filthy, but what his sandals can direct them down a new path. However we have corrupted our spiritual self is immaterial. Wanting to have God restore us is what it's all about. However, all of God's ability to cover, to cleanse, and to create are dependent upon one thing. They're dependent upon my return. That's what they depend upon. As we think about that prodigal, Luke chapter 15 and verse 17 says he came to his senses. Folks, when you and I are following our way, forgetting the danger signs and the guideposts, forgetting the highway, we're following ourselves, and we need to come back to our spiritual senses. And the the prodigal in the pig pen, it says he came to his senses. And then he said to himself, I will get up and I will go to my father, and I will say, Father, I have sinned against you. Take me back and make me as one of your hired servants. He said, I will go back. He said it in his head. But you know what? He wasn't there yet. And I think one of Satan's greatest hindrances to you and I restoring our spiritual purity is we come to our senses enough to know we don't have what we once had. We even come around to admitting what we should do, but we never get it done. And so the prodigal is not restored by the power of God until the Scripture says, so he got up and came to his father. And folks, for us to have spiritual restoration in us, we've got to get up and come. We've got to get up and come. We've got to make the movement, not just be convinced it's what we should do. We need to do it. So it's very common imagery in the Old Testament, some powerful lessons we learn about God and his desire for pure virgins in a spiritual sense. But we come to the New Testament, and we find that it also is imagery that is used by the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 11. We begin at verse 1. I hope you will put up with a little of my foolishness, but you already are doing that. I am jealous for you with a godly jealousy. I promised you to one husband, to Christ, so that I might present you as a pure virgin to him. But I am afraid that just as Eve was deceived by the serpent's cunning, your minds may somehow be led astray from your sincere and pure devotion to Christ. Paul, writing to the Corinthian church, and we may think, well, there's one issue. How can those people be considered pure? But that's what Paul calls them. We'll deal later with the church as the bride of Christ. The imagery at this point is that Paul is saying the church is the pure virgin that is going to be presented as that bride. And he notes, again, his own jealousy about that, the emotional tie that he has with that. I think imagery here goes back to the fact that the high priest in the Old Testament could only marry a virgin. And we recognize here in Leviticus chapter 21 that that's the truth. But who now is the high priest? Jesus, the Christ. He's now the high priest. Who can he marry? He can only marry a virgin. And Paul says, I have this godly jealousy that I want to present you before Christ as a pure virgin. Jesus as a high priest can only marry those who are virgins, and Paul claims that he is the one who's presented those pure hearts who are qualified to marry Christ. I also would notice Paul's tremendous emotional involvement in this. He has a longing for these spiritual people to be able to present them pure to Jesus. I think initially, any father who has ever had the occasion to present their daughter to a groom has a little bit of an understanding of what was going on in Paul's mind when he wrote this. The idea of walking that which has depended upon you, which you have worked years to teach, and presenting that to someone else in all of their purity and beauty is a very emotional thing. And Paul says, I have that in a spiritual sense. In my time with various parts of Jesus' body in various parts of the country, I can tell you that this is a very real emotional thing for people who choose to minister with God's church. Longing to present people pure to Jesus. I also will tell you that sometimes I'm at a loss as how to get that accomplished. I realize it's not just my response, it's God's ability based upon people's response. But how do you get people to respond to following their will instead of God's? How do you get people who think they are God's people, who are sacrificing incense to false gods, to realize, hey, it's time for you to say, I've had enough? And the place where I just keep coming back is, you just, with all long suffering, you teach, you try to set example, you try to do as right as you can. Folks, I believe very firmly in every place I've ever been, there are people who play at Christianity whom God cannot allow to be married to his son because they're not pure. And so this morning, my hope and my prayer is that if that describes where you think you are this morning, that you will have had enough, that you will set the danger signs, raise the guideposts, come back to the highway, climb the staircase, that it will not be a matter of, yes, I should do that. It will be, I am going to do it now. I'm going to allow God to make me his pure virgin again. We've just started this portrait. Next time I'm going to address, so what does a virgin church look like? What does that virgin look like that's being presented to God?